Hello, welcome to Bits and Biology. My name's Liz, and today I'm going to show you how to play the 1 to 4 player game Atiwa. Atiwa is a worker placement game designed by Uwe Rosenberg and inspired by research into the importance of fruit bats in maintaining forest biodiversity in Africa, specifically in Ghana. It takes about 30 minutes per player to play. In Atiwa, players are working to develop a small community near the Atiwa Range in Ghana, where they will create housing for new families and share their knowledge about the importance of fruit bats in the ecosystem and the negative effects of mining. To be successful, you must acquire new land and manage your animals and resources in a way that balances the needs of the community and the environment. Let's go down to the table and I'll show you how to play Atiwa. Atiwa is played over 7 rounds, where players will first take turns placing their workers to take actions that will help them acquire new land, recruit and train new families, increase their populations of domesticated and wild animals, grow trees, and earn gold. On each turn, players will also have the opportunity to send their fruit bats into the night to help reforest their land. At the end of each round, players will earn gold, gain new animals and trees, feed their families, and sometimes welcome new families into their community. To set up the game, you will first place the action board in the middle of the play area. You will attach the board extension. There's a couple of them to choose from. You will attach the board extension that matches the player count. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of the extensions, this one shows 2 players in the bottom right-hand corner, and so is for the 1 to 2 player game. On the other side, we have 4 people in the bottom right corner. So this is for the 4-player game. And this extension shows 3 people in the bottom right corner. And so this is for the 3-player game. I'm eventually going to be setting up for a solo game, so I'm going to attach the 1 to 2 player extension. But just know that they differ by the number of worker placement spots that are available on them. Next, you will take these action space tiles, and there are 6 of them. And you will shuffle these and place one on each of the spaces marked 1 through 7. Starting with 7, working your way backwards so that space number 1 will actually remain uncovered. Next, you will shuffle the terrain cards and place the entire stack face down above the left corner of the action board. And notice these 2 action spaces below the terrain cards. You'll draw 3 cards or 4 cards, depending on your player count, from the deck and place them above the workers' placement spots that are at the top of the board. So in a 3 and 4 player game, there would be a 4th spot here at the top of the board extension. Next, sort the location cards by name and place the stacks face up below the corresponding action spaces at the bottom of the action board. From left to right, these are farmstead, settlement, village, and town. You can also tell them apart by the number of houses on each card. Next, you will put all of the pollution markers, so these that have the dark on one side and either a picture of 1 or 2 pieces of gold or just a portion of a river, put all those into the cloth bag that's provided with the game. The pollution tokens represent the pollution that is generated from gold mining, and you may accumulate those during the game under certain conditions. Next, you'll place the gold and fruit bat tokens in a general supply somewhere in reach of all of the players near the action board. And you should also keep the scoring pad nearby because you may need it during the game. So that's how you set up the common play area. Next, each player will set up their personal play area. You'll give each player a supply board. Players should leave enough room below their supply board for 2 or 3 rows of cards. This is where players will place terrain and location cards that they collect. You'll give each player 8 wild animals, 13 trees, 8 fruit, 13 families, and 7 goats. Players will place these tokens on the corresponding spaces on their supply board. For the families, all of the families have 2 sides. They have an untrained side and they have a trained side. The trained side shows a fruit bat icon and the untrained side does not. You want to make sure that all of the families on the supply board are with their untrained side facing up. You'll give each player a set of 3 worker tokens, a set of 3 overview cards, and a night card, and these will be in the color of their choice, which you can tell by looking at the backs of the cards. In the solo game, players will need a set of cards, the overview cards and the night card, along with the red, the yellow, and the blue worker tokens. Each player also takes a village card and places it in the third position underneath their supply board. Each player will take the leftmost family token and place it on the unoccupied house here in the bottom right corner of the village card. You will determine who will be the start player and give them the start player marker. In clockwise order, the other players will get a compensation based on their position relative to the start player, and this is to mitigate any first player advantage. Compensations are noted on the setup card each player received earlier, so in a two-player game, the first person gets the start marker, the second person will get a wild animal, and so on. The game is played over 7 rounds. Each round starts with a work phase in which players take turns, placing one worker per turn for a total of 3 turns for each player. After taking the actions associated with placing each worker, players may optionally take the fruit bat action. Once each player has placed all 3 of their workers, the work phase is complete and players proceed to the maintenance phase, where players may simultaneously perform the associated tasks. In your first game or two, I actually recommend that all players step through the different tasks of the maintenance phase together to make sure that everybody is doing them correctly. But after your first game or two, then everybody can just do those simultaneously on their own. The game ends after step 5 of the maintenance phase of round 7. Points are scored in 6 different categories: gold, the cards located in your tableau, points from your supply board, points from trained families, the ones showing the fruit bat icon, points from fruit bats, and negative points that will be noted on the score sheet for missing food. It is an Uwe Rosenberg game, so of course you will have to feed your families. And the player with the most points wins. In the case of a tie, the player with the fewest pollution markers wins, and if still tied, the players will share the victory. Let's first take a look at what happens in the work phase. Beginning with the start player and in clockwise order, players are going to take turns placing a worker and then immediately carrying out the associated actions. Each player has 3 workers, and this number remains the same throughout the game. It will not change. So a few general rules for actions. If an action space, these are these spaces showing the little gray worker symbol. If an action space provides multiple actions, you can take them in any order. You can collect fewer tokens than you are supposed to. And if you cannot or do not want to carry out an action, you can simply ignore it. You can place a worker on an action space and not carry out any of its actions, though there is one slight exception to that I will talk about when we talk about the location cards. These action space tiles, as we will find out, will get moved during the maintenance phase, one space over. These action space tiles have, you can see the worker placement spot is actually on the tile, so they'll have actions associated with the tile itself and then some actions noted below the tile. And when you place a worker on that worker placement spot, you would take all of those actions, the ones on the tile as well as the ones below the tile. And that's true even for round spaces where there is not currently an action tile. Let's take a look first at the terrain and location cards. To acquire the terrain cards, these cards located above the board here, a player would place a worker on one of these worker placement spots. They would gain the card above that spot as well as the tokens associated with that spot. So in this case, a tree with fruit. Here they would get a bat, and here they would get a wild animal. Terrain cards provide spaces to place animals and trees, and sometimes families. You can see by the token symbols what can be placed on each spot. They're also worth points, as you can see in the top left corner, although some of them are negative points, as you can see with this animal farm here. And that's usually, the terrain cards are usually negative points if they also contain a house, because usually these ones don't contain houses. When you gain a terrain card, this is placed face up below your supply board, orthogonally adjacent to a card that you already have. So for instance, I could put this hillside terrain card here, here, or here. The cards must be upright so that the name is in the top left corner. And like I showed before, you can start a new row even before you have finished the previous row, as long as the card you're placing is orthogonally adjacent to another card that has previously been placed. And as I think I mentioned before, these cards below your supply board are called your tableau. You can have any number of cards arranged in any number of rows, but there is a maximum of 4 cards per row. And additionally, where you place a card is actually only going to be relevant for pollution. And so I'll talk about how you place pollution tokens when we talk about the maintenance phase. So those are terrain cards. There is an additional action up here I haven't talked about where you could place a worker here, and there's actually 2 worker placement spots here. And you can just take the top card from the terrain deck and place that into your tableau, and also gain a tree from your supply board. All tokens that you gain come from your supply board from left to right. Now let's take a look at these location cards that are located at the bottom of the board here. Location cards cost gold and trees, and that's noted right underneath where you place your worker. So for instance, the farmstead costs 1 gold and 1 tree, all the way up to the town card, which is worth 13 points and costs 10 gold and 7 trees. Notice that there are 2 worker placement spots above each of these location cards. One of them is a little grayed out, which some people find a bit confusing. This is a second worker placement spot. It's grayed out so that you notice that the worker placement spot on the left is cheaper than the worker placement spot on the right. There is no prohibition against the same player taking up both worker placement spots, like there is with some worker placement spots on the 4-player extension. Wherever you see these 2 arrows that are sort of broken in between, the same player cannot occupy both of those worker placement spots. So back to these location cards. When acquiring a location card, you also get to take the first player marker, and that's noted by the picture of the first player marker in between these 2 worker placement locations. And so within a round, the first player marker can actually change hands several times every time somebody takes a location card. When you take this action, and this is the one exception to being able to place a worker and not having to take all the actions, you can only take the first player marker if you also take the location card, which does come with a cost, of course. So notice that the biggest difference between the terrain cards and the location cards are that the terrain cards are free, but they rarely provide houses for families, and when they do, it's usually with a negative point penalty, whereas the location cards will have a number of houses on them specific to the location type, from 1 house with a farmstead up to 4 houses with a town. When you're collecting tokens from these worker placement spots, like let's say I come here, I would take the goat from off of my supply board, starting at the left and working my way left to right across my board. So I would take this goat and place it on a space with a goat icon. That's where I can place my goat. Or I could also place it on a blank space if there is already a goat on that card. And I'll talk a little bit more about blank spaces here in a moment. Gold and fruit bats are taken from the general supply, and these markers are meant to never run out. So if you do happen to run out, you would just substitute a suitable replacement. Recall that I mentioned there are 2 sides to the family tokens, an untrained side and a trained side. Families are always first placed with their untrained side up, and then they can be trained by taking the training action, and that is this action here that shows a family with the fruit bat icon and an arrow. And so, for instance, if I were to put my worker here on this first space, I would be able to gain a family. I would take that from the leftmost spot on my supply board, and it also lets me train that family immediately. And so I would put it with the fruit bat side facing up. The training action represents sharing your knowledge with that family on the conservation of the environment and the importance of fruit bats in it. Fruit bats, which were once scorned and hunted as mere fruit thieves, are in fact incredibly useful animals, which was the inspiration for this game. Although the nocturnal animals continue to eat fruit from the trees, they also spread the seeds of those trees over large areas of the country, helping to reforest fallow land and, in the medium term anyway, improve harvests because they're increasing the numbers of trees. And so this is very valuable to the fruit farmers in the medium term. This realization has led to a symbiotic cooperation between fruit bats and fruit farmers in this region of southeastern Ghana where this game is set, which is located near the Atiwa range. In this region, fruit bats are actually kept as pets to increase the size of fruit farms more quickly. So the more fruit bats that a family has roosting nearby them, the more likely those fruit bats are to poop out the seeds on their land, and then they will grow up more fruit trees. Consequently, fruit farmers in this region leave tall trees in place as roosts, which provide shelter for the fruit bats, rather than hunting them for the very little meat that they provide, because in this region, fruit bats are hunted for their meat because they're actually quite sizable animals. Notice that each trained family provides room for one fruit bat token. So you could place a fruit bat token on that family if you were to gain a fruit bat token. So back to these blank spaces, these are located on both terrain and location cards, and these spaces provide room for a token of any type except for families. You can't place families on blank spaces, and with the caveat that a token of that type has to already be located on the card. So since this card, for instance, has a goat and a bat on it, I could place a goat or a bat into that blank space. If there is a tree with fruit that is already on that card, if I gain a fruit, and you'll see how this can happen when we talk about the maintenance phase, I can actually place that fruit on that blank spot as long as there is already a fruit token on that card. Notice that I don't have to have a tree in that spot to be able to do that. Do note that if I had a tree on that blank spot, which I could do if I had a tree somewhere else on the card, I could put a fruit on that tree even though there's not already a fruit on this tree. That would be a totally legal thing you could do. So there's a worker placement spot on the board that I actually misunderstood at first, and I think this is a common misunderstanding, so I want to talk about this spot in particular, and that is this fruit bats in empty houses worker placement spot. So if I put my worker here, it has this icon showing a fruit bat with an arrow pointing at an empty house. So if I have a house without a family, and in fact, let me just put another card out here, and let's see if I have... got to be one. Here we go. So I'm going to put these two cards out here. Notice on this terrain card, I have two houses that have a red line through them, and these are uninhabitable houses. So I just want to show you how this worker placement spot works. What it is telling me is that for all of my unoccupied houses, the ones without families, and this includes the uninhabitable houses, I would take a fruit bat and place it on each of these empty houses. This can be a very valuable worker placement spot if you have a lot of empty houses. You can also, these bats, when you take the fruit bat action, which I'm going to talk about next, these would come up to your night board, so we'll talk about that, leaving these houses empty again. These bats would not then be able to move back into the houses. The only way that fruit bats can be put into empty houses is with this fruit bats in empty houses action. Anyway, that is how the fruit bats in empty houses action works. Now, if you are gaining a family, so let's say all these houses were covered up, and then let's say I took the action that lets me gain a family, I would take my leftmost family and, oh, I don't have any empty houses, right? They're covered up with fruit bats. Well, I could remove this fruit bat and place this family into that empty house, but I would not then be able to place the fruit bat on that family because notice that they're not trained. Unless if I were taking this first action here, which gives me a family and lets me train a family in the same turn, that would be the only situation where that bat in that house would be able to stay there. And that is only if I can train that family in the same turn that I acquire it. That is only possible in round 1 and then again in round 6. Now let's talk about this fruit bat action. At the end of each turn, so after you have placed your worker, you may optionally carry out what is called the fruit bat action. So you can do this up to 3 times per round. Like I said, once after each time you place a worker. Once you've completed all the actions associated with that worker, you can take 3 fruit bats from your tableau, place them on your night card. Then you will spend 1 fruit, so you have to have a fruit available down here to spend. That fruit will go back to your supply board, and you can then gain a tree as long as you have a place to put it. And I have a place right here where I can put that tree. What this is representing is the fruit bat's daily search for food and how new trees grow, like I said before, from their excreting the seeds on their way home. So it's a pretty cool mechanism in this game. Do note that the rulebook says that first-time players tend to forget about the fruit bat action. I'll tell you that even after several plays of this game, I still tend to forget about the fruit bat action. So keep reminding each other of it if you're playing with multiple people, and let players take the action retroactively. This is actually printed in the rulebook to let players take the action retroactively if they notice before taking their next turn. So again, they would have had to have a fruit to spend, and they would have had to have a tree on their supply board that they can bring down, and then also have a place to put that tree. But we're pretty forgiving when we play this game about, oops, I forgot to take the fruit bat action, and letting each other do that, usually right before your next turn. Note that you can use fruit bats you have just collected during that worker action prior to that. The fruit bats and fruit can come from the same or different cards in your tableau, so they don't have to come from the same card. They can come from different cards. And the fruit bats on your night card are going to return in step 3 of the maintenance phase. So you want to keep that in mind so that you have some places to put them when they return back to your cards. Keeping in mind that if some of those bats came from empty houses, they will not then be able to go back to those empty houses, because again, you can only do that with the fruit bats and empty houses action. All right, I just want to wrap up our discussion of the work phase with a couple of notes. If you look at the board extension, you can see that these 2 worker placement spots depend on the number of these icons that you have in your tableau. And these icons are located on terrain cards. Most of the terrain cards will have 1 of these icons. These are a nature icon. A few of them don't have any nature icons, like this animal farm here. And there's at least 1 card that has 2 nature icons in it. So for this worker placement spot here, you would get a number of gold equal to the number of nature icons that are present in your tableau below your supply board. And if you have 4 terrain cards, now they don't have to have a nature icon on them, they just have to say terrain below their title. If you have at least 4 terrain cards, you would also be able to train 1 family. This worker placement spot allows you to train a number of families equal to the number of nature icons you have in your tableau. And if you have 4 terrain cards, at least 4, you will get 1 gold piece. On the 4-player extension, you can see that this pair of worker placement spots differs by this bonus here for having 4 terrain cards. And furthermore, like I think I mentioned before, you can't have the same worker on both of these worker placement spots, and that's represented by this double arrow here. Most of the worker placement spots are going to give you either animals or gold or some combination of those. This worker placement spot here, you would choose, I'm going to take the tile off so you don't get confused there. If it were round 4, for instance, you would gain a family, untrained, and you would have the choice of gaining 2 bats or a wild animal. So that's what that slash means there. And here you would pay 1 gold to gain 2 goats, and we'll find out in just a moment why that's really important. Here you can pay 2 gold and get 2 families. These worker placement spots that give you a tree with fruit, that tree and that fruit have to be placed into the same spot. So I would have to have a place to place it, and they would go together like that. I think that lets you know everything you need to know about the work phase. So let's talk about now the maintenance phase. The maintenance phase consists of 7 steps, and these steps have to be carried out in the given order, and they're all noted on this card, this overview card that everybody has. First, you determine income. Then players will collect wild animals, trees, and fruit from their supply board. Fruit bats will then be returned from the night card. Then you will feed your families or incur the consequences. Then we have a breeding step, followed by removing your workers from the board and then preparing for the next round. So let's take a look at each of these steps in order. So in the income phase, for each trained family in your tableau, you will collect 1 gold from the general supply. For each untrained family in your tableau, you would draw 1 pollution marker out of the bag. And if that has gold pieces on the other side, you would collect those gold pieces. Then you would take that pollution marker and, following particular placement rules, place it in your tableau. So starting with the top row and going left to right, you'll place 1 pollution marker on the top middle space of each card, unless it already is polluted. And furthermore, if there were a token on that space and you had to place a pollution marker there, you would lose whatever was on that space because, well, pollution destroys everything. To clarify some things that can be confusing, let's take a look at what happens if we have more than 1 row. So you would go row by row and first fill up these middle spots in the top row. And then you would go row by row and fill up these next spots to the right there, these top right corners, and you would do that row by row. And then once you have filled up all of the top rows, then you would go to the middle row and do the same thing, going from left to right, and then the bottom row finally going from left to right. Now there is a simplified version of this that has been sanctioned by the publisher, and it has been play tested, and that is, if you would rather, and so everybody would have to agree on this before the start of the game, you can instead just place pollution just going left to right on the rows. So still filling up the top rows before you go to the middle row, and so on. And again, you would lose any tokens associated with a spot that gains a pollution marker. So that has been play tested. So you would just want to agree with your players before the game gets started how it is that you want to place pollution. It's worth noting that there is no way to get rid of pollution. Once it is there on your cards, it is there, and you can't place anything on a space with pollution. Next step in the maintenance phase is where we collect wild animals, trees, and fruit. So you'll start at the top of your supply board, and for each row, so we start with the wild animals. So the thing you collect is shown in the far left space, either trees, fruit, or fruit bats, and so we're only dealing with these first 3 rows here. And the number of those that you will collect depends on how many of these things you have already placed on your tableau. And so for instance here, in my wild animal row, I will collect 1 tree, so I remove that from my supply board. Now again, I have to have a place to put it in my tableau. Remove that. Next, I come to the tree row, and I am going to take 2 fruit. So I remove those from my supply. And again, I have to have a place to put them. Now remember, since this terrain card has a tree with fruit on it, I could place that fruit in a blank spot. I could also place this fruit on a tree that doesn't already have a fruit on it. And then I'll come here to the fruit row and notice that I get 1 fruit bat. See how there's a 1 in each of these spaces. So I would have to have a place to put that. I'm going to put that fruit bat right there. Now I'm done with gaining trees, fruit, and fruit bats. If you can't collect the full amount because you don't have room on your cards, just collect only as much as you can. You can't set it off to the side, so you have to have a place to put it. You can choose to collect fewer tokens than you are supposed to. So for instance, if you want to leave room for something else later, and keeping in mind that this step represents the natural course of things. Wild animals eat fruit. They excrete the seeds. This causes new trees to grow. Trees grow fruit, which then will attract fruit bats. All right, third step of the maintenance phase is to bring the fruit bats from your night card back home. So again, you have to have places to put them. I could put them on trained families or any place that has a fruit bat symbol, or on a blank space if that card already has a fruit bat on it. You must return as many fruit bats as you can, and you'll return any fruit bats for which you have no room on your cards. You'll return those back to the general supply. Next, because this is Neuve Rosenberg game, we need to make sure to feed our families. So you will look at the rightmost empty spaces for your family row and your goat row, and you will subtract the number in the goat row, so in this case 2, from the number showing in your family row, in this case 5. So 5 minus 2 is 3. I have to have 3 food to feed my families. Goats are worth 3 food. Wild animals are worth 2 food. Fruit is worth 1 food. And only for untrained families you have, so let's say I have an untrained family here, you would be able to spend a fruit bat to cover 1 food cost up to the number of untrained families you have. Notice that this is representing the fact that we get milk from goats, so that's what that 2 that you're subtracting from the family number is representing. So in this case, the goats are providing 2 food through their milk, leaving a 3 food deficit left over. So in this case, maybe I choose to return a goat, which is worth 3 food, back to my supply board. That does not negate the milk that was gained from that goat. So you apparently milked it before you slaughtered it for its meat. If you don't have enough tokens to satisfy your food demand, you're going to lose 2 points for each missing food. And you'll simply make a tally mark on the score sheet for each of the 2 points that somebody loses because they were missing food. And then you'll be able to incorporate that into the score at the end of the game. Note that you can't voluntarily suffer the point penalty just to save tokens. If you have the tokens, you have to spend them. Next, we go to breeding, and this is marked on this overview card on the bottom here, and then also on the board. So in phase 1, we can see that if we have at least 2 families, I will gain another family. So I have a trained family here, and a trained family here. So I have 3 families, so I meet that minimum requirement. I would gain an untrained family as long as I have a place to put it. So you're going to want to plan ahead for that. Here I have to have at least 1 fruit bat token in my tableau. And if I do, I would gain another fruit bat token. And if I have at least 1 wild animal, which I do, I would gain another wild animal. And again, you have to have places to put these. And you can plan ahead for what's coming as far as breeding by looking on your overview card. What are the requirements for breeding in each of the upcoming rounds? Keep in mind that if you have at least the indicated number of the depicted token in your tableau and you have room for another one, you will collect 1 token of that type. You will never collect more than 1 token of a particular type during the breeding phase. Step 6 in the maintenance phase is to collect your workers from the board. And then step 7 is to prepare for the next round. So you will replace any face-up terrain cards from the deck. If there were any cards left over at the end of the round, so let's say at the end of the round this card was left over, I would simply put that into a discard pile and then refresh all of the terrain spaces. If the draw deck ever runs out, you would shuffle the discard pile to create a new draw deck. Next, you will shift the leftmost action tile 1 space to the left. Notice that you are uncovering the number of the next round. The game will end after step 5 of the maintenance phase after the last round. So once all of these action tiles have shifted over and you have completed step 5 of the maintenance phase in round 7, then the game ends. Points are scored in 6 different categories. Each gold is worth 1 point. For the cards, you're going to total the points shown in the top left corner, making sure to subtract any negative points. You will look at your supply board and gain the number of points shown on the rightmost uncovered spot in each row. So in this case, 1 point for wild animals, 2 points for trees, 1 point for fruit, 7 points for families, and 1 point for goat. Of course, by the end of the game, hopefully you have uncovered way more than that. If you manage to place all of your families out in your tableau, that's worth 25 points. But keep in mind, you're going to have to feed all those families, so that's not always worth it to shoot for that as a goal. Your trained families, the ones that are showing the fruit bat icon, those are worth 1 point each. There's no penalty for untrained families. They're just not worth a point. Fruit bats, you're going to take the first 10 and remove them from consideration. So what do I have here? 4, 5, 6, 7. I only have 8. So I would score no points for fruit bats. But any number you have beyond 10 will score you 1 point each. And then next, you will want to subtract out any points for missing food that was noted on the score sheet during the game. And the player with the most points will win. In the case of a tie, the player with the fewest pollution markers is going to win. And if you're still tied, players will share the victory. So now I just want to talk about some changes with the solo game. You're going to use the board extension that shows 2 people in the bottom right corner. And if you look at these board extensions, let's see if I can get this out of here. So this side is the 3-player side, and it has a 1 to 2 player side on the other side of that, and then the 4-player board extension also has a 1 to 2 player side on them. They're both the same. So you would choose one of those to put onto the board. Setup is otherwise the same as the multiplayer game, except that the solo player is going to use not just the workers of one color, they're going to use all of the red, blue, and yellow workers. And what I want you to notice is that on the board, I'm just going to take off these action tiles. On the board for each of the round spaces, these get revealed. Remember, we shift the tiles over and the round number gets revealed for each round. These are color-coded for the solo game. So in the first round, players will place all of their red workers. So I'm just going to show you how this works. If you've played the solo game of Feast for Odin, this will be familiar to you. So first, in round 1, you would place all of your red workers. So I'm just going to place these out to show you how this works. And then, of course, at the end, during the maintenance phase, at the end of the maintenance phase, you would shift that tile over. Now we're in round 2. It's time to place the yellow workers. The red workers will stay on the board. So they're getting in your way, basically. And I'm going to place my yellow workers. And then this gets shifted over. Now, when you're shifting the tiles, I will shift the tile, but the worker doesn't move with it if there's a worker on there. It will still stay in the same location. Likewise, if there was a worker here, if we place that yellow worker there in round 2, and when I shift this tile over, that worker will again stay in the same location. It would just be placed on that tile now. Now in round 3, I would place all of my blue workers. And now for round 4, it's showing red. I'm leaving the blue and yellow workers. I will just pick up the red workers, and now I will place those for round 4. So once you have completed the first 3 rounds, there will always already be 2 colors of worker on the board when you go to place your workers for that round. All other rules are the same as the multiplayer game, except for refreshing the terrain cards in step 7 of the maintenance phase, so during the preparation for the next round. So notice here I'm missing a terrain card. That will get replaced, but there are 2 ways you can approach this. According to the rule book, you will not discard any of the remaining terrain cards, but instead just replenish the missing card. Alternatively, before drawing new terrain cards, so we'll just go back to where we were, before drawing new terrain cards, you may discard any number of face-up terrain cards above the game board. And so maybe I choose to discard that into the discard pile and then reveal 2 new cards. So again, this is not in the rule book this way. This change was suggested by the publisher in a Board Game Geek forum post and is consistent with the rationale behind the original rule, which was to not have to discard terrain cards you did not yet have a chance to take because of workers from a previous round blocking that space. So let's say, I had a yellow worker there, and so that terrain card would have already been in place, right, after I was done placing my blue workers. And, maybe I don't want to discard that because I haven't had a chance to take it and I really want that card. So I really like that rule. So again, that is before drawing new terrain cards, you may discard any number of face-up terrain cards above the game board. And again, this change was suggested by the publisher and is consistent with their rationale behind the original rule. And so I'll provide a link to that forum post down in the description so you can read that yourself. Also, something that was changed in a forum post, in the rulebook, the scoring goal for the solo game is set at 120 points. And I'm not the only one who has a really hard time meeting that. And in fact, I have played this solo a number of times and I have not yet hit 120 points. In fact, I've barely gotten over 100 points so far. So the publisher has reduced that in a forum, again, in a forum post. I'll provide a link to that, that has been reduced to 110 points as the goal, which is still really challenging. I can tell you, I have not reached it yet. And I've played this solo, oh gosh, maybe a dozen times at least so far. There is on the last page of the rulebook, so on the back of the rulebook, there are these solo challenges that are available to you. It says, for variety, try to complete the following challenges. Unless stated otherwise, the above-mentioned solo game rules apply. The challenges are listed in no significant order. And so they just provide you with challenges to meet, and some of them adjust your point goal downwards. None of them go up above 120. And so that is how you play Atiwa solo. So I will also have a solo playthrough of this game on the channel, so make sure to check that out if you're interested. Keeping in mind that both the multiplayer and the solo rules are largely the same. The biggest difference is the placing of the workers and keeping workers from previous rounds on the board in the solo game only. And then also the way that you replace the terrain cards is a little bit different in the solo game. Otherwise, everything's the same. So if you're interested to see how the game plays, even for multiplayer, I encourage you to look at least the first round of solo play in the solo playthrough. And that's all I have for you for this how to play video. I hope you found that helpful. Thanks for watching. If you found it useful, please make sure to hit the like button, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.